Hi, boys and girls. It's time for another story. Our story today is called No One Will Ever Know. Well, it was the second week in June, and school was out for the year. Bobby and his older brother Tommy were so excited that school was over. Not that they didn't like school, but it's always exciting when summer comes. And this year they were going to have a special treat. They were going to get to go and spend the summer with their grandfather and grandmother. Tommy and Bobby, they lived in town, but Grandpa and Grandma, they lived out on a farm. It wasn't a huge farm, but it was enough to support Grandma and Grandpa. They'd never gotten to go there by themselves before. Well, the first morning after they got there, while they were eating their pancakes, Grandpa said, "Well, I'm sure you guys are going to have lots of fun here this summer, but you're going to have to help with the work on the farm. There's a lot to be done even on a small farm, and there's no reason you boys can't help." Well, Grandma, when she needed help, it was things like going out and picking the beans in the garden or picking the strawberries. But Grandpa had jobs for them to do. They could last all day. Well, Grandpa had a field. Like I said, the farm wasn't huge, so he didn't have humongous fields like some of the farmers do. But he had a field that he decided that he was going to raise corn in this year. It would give them something to sell. Plus, it would give Grandma corn to freeze and can. And he had decided that Tommy and Abby should be the ones to plant it, a whole field by hand. Now, because it was such a small farm, Grandpa didn't have big planting machines. They had to plant by hand, just like they would have years and years ago. Grandpa said, "Tomorrow morning we'll start the planting." Well, there were some very special things there on the farm that the boys loved. There was a big pond that they could go swimming in. And now that it was actually summer, it was getting hot. And that nice, cool water in that pond sure would feel good to them. Well, the next morning, at the crack of dawn, right after the sun came up, Grandpa came knocking on their bedroom door. "Time to get up, boys," he said. And so they got up, and they put on their overalls that they had to use to work at Grandpa's. Came out, and ooh, Grandma had wonderful things made for breakfast. Well, Grandpa was sitting at the end of the table. He said, "As soon as you're done eating, I'm going to take you out and show you how to plant the corn." Grandpa gathered those two boys up, and he got a hoe for each one of them. And then he got 2 bags, canvas bags, and they had straps on them that went across the shoulders. This was what Grandpa put corn seed in. Well, when you go to the store, you get little packages like this of seed. Well, it doesn't take long to plant that. But these canvas bags were at least half to 3/4 full of corn seed. And Tommy, he thought, it's going to take forever to plant all this. When they got out in the field, Grandpa took one of the boys' hoes and he said, "I'm going to show you what to do, and I want you to do it just as I say." So he took that hoe. The ground was already plowed, and you could see the rows that Grandpa had made with the plowing. And he said, now I want each of you to take a row, and you take your hoe, and he got a hold of the handle of it, and he said, you go chop in the ground, and the hoe will make a hole about this deep. And into that hole, I want you to drop 1, 2, 3 corn seeds. Then I want you to take your right foot and I want you to go stomp, stomp. So, do you get it, boys? You go chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. And every heel of corn needs to be at least 12 inches apart. Grandpa said, now I got stuff to do. I got to go repair tractor. You boys just keep working. And when lunch comes, you listen for Grandma's cowbell. And you can come in and have a good lunch. And you know, if you guys do a good job, later on this afternoon, I'll swim in that pond. The boys thought that was a wonderful idea. So they started with great enthusiasm. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. And they headed across that field. Well, at first it was kind of fun, but as the morning wore on, it got warmer and warmer. Now they had their little jug of water for drinks, but boy, was it getting hot out here. And their arm, their shoulder from all that chomping with the hoe was getting tired. Poppy said, you know, it's getting hot out here. I can't wait for Grandma to ring that cowbell. I'm getting hungry. But they kept working. But they weren't going as fast now. Chop. 1, 2, 3. Stomp, stomp. Not nearly like they had been in the morning. The chomp, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp, had long since stopped. They were going slower and slower. Bobby, he looked out toward the end of the field. He said, I can't even see the end of it. But they kept working. Pretty soon they finally came to the end of that first row, and they started going back the other way. Bobby's row was finished, and Tommy's row was finished, and now they both had new rows, and they were working on them. When they got to the end of those rows, they started back the other way, always going chomp, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Well, then it was lunchtime, and sure enough, they had heard that cowbell ringing, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. Nobody had to tell them twice to go in for dinner. They put their hose at the end of their rows, and they had marked in the field where they stopped planting, and they took off on a run to the house. Well, when they got in the house, they sat down at the table, and Grandpa said, how you boys doing out there? And they said, fine. It's hot. That's a lot of work. That's a really big field. Grandpa looked at him and he said, yep, it's big all right, but it's going to grow us some good corn, and you boys are helping to make the farm run. Now, this afternoon, I want you to get busy and get as much done as you can before I come out and call you and tell you you can go to that pond. Well, after dinner, Grandpa, he always laid down for a nap. He was getting old, and the nap seemed like a necessary part of his life now. So he went in the living room where it was cool, and he lay down on the couch, and he went sound asleep. Well, Tommy and Bobby, they went back out to that field and they started the process again. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. And when they turned around and looked, they had quite a few rows done now. Hours went by. Wonder when Grandpa's gonna call us. Maybe he's forgotten, Bobby said. No, I don't think he's forgotten, Tommy said. And they continued to plant. Well, a little while later, Tommy, he sat down right there in the middle of that field and he said, "This is silly. Nobody's going to know if we planted it or not, or whether the crows came and ate up the seed. Nobody's going to know. I have an idea." And do you know what that idea was? They had come to probably, I think they were halfway through the field, and there in the field stood a huge oak tree. Grandpa left it there. He liked it, he said. Wasn't a good place for a tree, but he didn't want to chop it down either. Tommy said, "Come here, Bobby." Bobby said, "I need to keep planting." Tommy said, "Well, I'm not going to plant any more today." And he took his hoe and he took that bag of seed over under that big oak tree. And he took the hoe and he started chopping, 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 till he'd made a big hole in the ground. Then he looked around. There wasn't anybody to see him. Nope. From where he was in the field, he couldn't even see the house. He wondered where Grandpa was. Was Grandpa still asleep? Or was he out in the barn? He'd never worried about before what Grandpa saw him doing, but he'd never done anything like this before. This was kind of dishonest. That big hole he made, he took that big bag of corn seed and he dumped it over into it. Then he took that hoe and as quickly as he could, he covered up all that seed. Then he smoothed it out, and when he looked at it, he thought, "No one will ever know that I didn't plant that seed. They'll just think that the seed wasn't good or that the crows came and ate it up." Then he turned to Bobby, who was still in the field planting. He said, "I'm going to the pond. I don't care what you do. I'm too hot." And he walked off. He didn't go by the house. He didn't go by the barn. He didn't want anybody to see him. He got down to the pond. He stuck his toe in. It was so nice and cool. He pulled off his shirt and he pulled off his overalls and he jumped into that pond and he started swimming around. It felt glorious. But after he'd been in there a little while, it wasn't as much fun as he thought it would be. Matter of fact, it wasn't any fun at all without Bobby there to splash and play with him. Then he got to thinking, what if Grandpa finds out? Oh, I'm going to be in big trouble if Grandpa finds out. And all the fun of going to the pond was gone. He sat there, he didn't know what to do, and then he thought, my hair's all wet. Somebody's going to know. So he got out, and he laid down in that hot sun. He thought, I better go back to the field before Grandpa comes out to check on us, and he finds me. By this time, his hair dried out. He had his overalls back on and his shirt, and he went the back way to the field again. But of course, when he got there, he didn't have any corn to plant, and Bobby was still diligently chop, 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. And he said, hey, give me a little bit of your corn seed. I'll plant some more here. It wasn't too long after that, the grandpa came out to the field. He said, "You boys been doing a pretty good job. You've gotten quite a bit done. Why don't you go play in the pond?" Well, Bobby was excited. He said, "Yay!" And he headed on a run to the pond. But Tommy didn't run as fast. It didn't even seem exciting to be able to get to go to the pond. He got there, and his mind, all he could think about was that whole sack of corn that was buried under the tree. Grandpa had said, "Did you plant all your corn, Tommy?" Well, what could Tommy say? He thought it really wouldn't be a lie to say yes, because he did plant all that corn in the ground. It just wasn't in the field where it belonged. So he said, "Yes, sir," while Tommy was sitting there by the edge of the pond. He had his hands sitting under his head, holding his head up, and all he could think about was now he hadn't obeyed and planted the corn. Then he had lied to Grandpa. One bad thing seemed to lead to another. Well, it didn't seem like it was too long till they heard Grandma ringing the cowbell again. And Tommy, he looked at Bobby and he said, "You won't tell, will you?" Bobby said, "No, I won't lie, though." Well, they got to the house, and Grandma, she had made a special supper, everything that those boys loved, plus apple pie with homemade ice cream. But Tommy's stomach, it didn't feel like eating all those good things, but he had to eat or somebody would know. Oh, why did he think that nobody would ever know? Well, evening came, and it was time for worship, and Grandpa had that special worship time that the boys always liked. Grandpa would tell them stories, and he would read out of the Bible. He read some things about be sure your sins will find you out. And Tommy thought, no, I wonder, does he know? Does he know? But Grandpa didn't say anything about Tommy, and soon it was bedtime. Tommy, he'd always, as soon as his head hit the pillow, he was out cold. But not tonight. He rolled this way and he rolled that way and he covered his head up. But he kept thinking, no one will ever know. Be sure your sins will find you out. No one will ever know. Well, all the rest of that week went by, and Grandpa, he didn't ask any questions. But sometimes Tommy thought Grandpa was looking at him sad, like, I wonder if he knows. Be sure your sins will find you out. Weeks went by. Finally, Grandpa started going out to that field that they had planted, and he was watching for the little green leaves of the corn that were going to come up. Sure enough, one day, there they were, those little green stalks of corn coming up out of that nice plowed field. At supper that night, Grandpa said, "Well, boys, your corn's coming up. Starting to look good. I'm a little worried. There's some parts there that don't look like anything's coming up yet, but we'll give it some more time." Tommy got a horrible thought. All that seed would germinate and start growing. What would happen when Grandpa saw all those corn plants under the oak tree? And that's exactly what happened. They all came up. Hundreds of little corn plants, all crushed together, right where he had put them, under the dirt in that hole. Oh, Tommy, he wished Grandpa knew. It would be easier than all this waiting around. Oh, why? His whole summer's being ruined. One day, Tommy snuck out to that cornfield, and he stood at the edge, and there under that oak tree was all those little corn plants. Brightest green you've ever seen. I thought nobody would know. Oh! And while he was standing there thinking about that, Grandpa came walking up behind him. He said, Tommy, do you have something to tell Grandpa? Tommy, he looked down and slowly started to cry. He said, oh, Grandpa, I didn't plant all the corn like I told you. I dug a hole under the oak tree, and I put it in there because it was too hot and I didn't want to work anymore. And I went to the pond when I wasn't supposed to. Oh, Grandpa, and I thought you'd never know. I thought nobody would ever know. And then you did that worship about be sure your sins will find you out. Oh, Grandpa, I'm so sorry. Then Tommy turned around and he looked at Grandpa. And Grandpa said, I knew, but I was waiting in hopes that you would come to me and ask for forgiveness. Tommy, he ran to his grandfather. He hugged him. He said, I'm so sorry. I'll never do anything like that again. I'll never. I know. I know that God could see. The grandfather was a wise man. He said, Tommy, I think you've been punished enough, and I think you've learned your lesson. Because even if I hadn't known, God would have known what you did. When you do disobedient things, God sees and records it in His book, and He's waiting in heaven for you to ask forgiveness. And you know, that evening, that's exactly what Tommy did. So that sin could be taken off of his record. And you know, Tommy was a better boy after that because he learned that your sins will be found out and that there's no such thing as nobody will ever know. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now. You have a good week.